Hey guys, and welcome to another tutorial for freshly squeezed samples. This is your host John Gran, and today we're going to be looking at the basics of synthesis. I wanted to start off with Serum because it is a synthesizer that most of you probably have used. You've probably seen a lot of people use it, and it just works as a great example for what we're going to cover today. But given the fact that we're going to be working specifically with subtractive synthesis, this is going to be a great synth to kind of show you a couple of things. Now, subtractive synthesis basically assumes that an acoustic instrument can be approximated with a simple oscillator that can produce waveforms with different frequency spectrums. And the signal path is basically set from the oscillators, and then it goes into a filter of some sort. And with any subtractive synthesizer, you're typically going to end up with what are called different oscillator forms. In this case, we're using the basic shapes wavetable that lets us scroll through all these different types of waveforms that you'll typically find in just about any other synthesizer. If we look at it from this perspective, we can see that here we have sort of like a sine wave. Here we have a saw wave. As you can see here, it's got kind of like these little points on it. With this one, we have what I believe is a triangle wave. Then we have a square wave. And typically, these are the most commonly used waveforms that you will see in any other synthesizer. So for instance, if you're using Silent, it'll probably come with these four waveforms. And then from there on, you can create these other ones, which I believe are typically called pulse modulations, which just kind of allow you to move the waveform a little bit to the left or right when you're doing a square wave. One of the really interesting features about Serum is that if you did want to edit the actual waveform itself, you can go into it like this. And as you can see up here, all of this is changing as well, showing you just in a grid pattern what is actually happening with the different harmonics and so forth with the actual synthesizer, or with the waveform, I should say. And obviously, when you edit it inside of this view, in the table edit, you're going to be able to see it in the actual wavetable later. So if I were to actually edit this one as well, you're going to start seeing different shapes being taken place. And this is one of the really cool features about Serum, is being able to actually sweep through these wavetables in order to create sounds. Now, let's actually go back to the basic shapes again, and let's talk a little bit about what each one of these different waveforms are typically useful for. So with a sine wave, which typically shows a very kind of looks like you have a couple of pyramids or sand dunes, I should say. These types of sounds are typically or these waveforms are typically reserved for things like sub bass. Sometimes you can use them for leads. And a lot of times they're just great for layering with other sounds as well, right? So if you're not familiar with what a sine wave sounds like, let's just go ahead and play it real quick. And it has a very specific kind of very clean overall sound. It's not very processed. It's very useful for clarity. And this is probably one of the reasons why it's used so much whenever people are working with sub basses, whenever you're working with sounds that you just kind of want to kind of get through the mix, but you don't really want to add a whole lot of harmonics to it. So it's really useful for this purpose, and a lot of people will end up using it as a lead as well in their tracks. Let's move on now to the next shape which we have, which is going to be a saw wave. And this is the one that you most commonly probably hear in most dance productions, and even mainstream and pop productions. You'll hear this sound a lot. It sort of becomes the foundation for a lot of different songs. So let's go ahead and play it real quick so you can hear what it sounds like. As you can hear there, it just kind of has a lot more tone. It has a lot more just overall sound. Typically with these guys, people will usually have them, kind of like in the Juno 106 style, where it kind of has like 4 different voices. And then, if you really want to stack them up and get sort of like a super saw sound, you end up playing with the detuning, and you'll get different types of tones with it. Let's go to the next one, which is going to be our triangle wave. This one right here is actually very similar to the way a sine wave would sound, but it just has a little bit of a different tone. Check it out. If we go back to the sine, just has a little bit more of an edge. Let's see what it sounds like when we start adding voices to it. Now this is another sound that is a lot of times used whenever you have way too many sounds in your track, and you just want something that's a little bit simpler to kind of kick in and cut through the mix. If you were to raise it up an octave, you kind of see what I'm talking about. It's got like a bellsy sort of kind of tone to it, right? Let's move on to the next sound, or the next waveform, which is going to be the square wave. And this is another one that is similar to a saw wave, but it's almost like combining a saw wave with a triangle and a sine wave. It has like a really unique tone to it. And this is one that is also very commonly used in leads, but it's also used in bass sounds. It's used in pads as well. It's used in all sorts of different scenarios. And if you were to kind of increase the voices on it, this is what it would sound like. It's a very powerful sound. It's really punchy. It really cuts through your mixes. You know, it sounds great also when you have it at lower octaves. You know, if you're looking for like that Reese kind of bass sound, this is always a good starting point to work with. So now that we've kind of gone over the basic waveforms and kind of what their different utilities and applications are, let's talk a little bit about our envelopes. Now, I'm assuming that most of us are familiar with an ADSR, but you know, in most synthesizers, you'll see that the A stands for attack, D stands for decay, S stands for sustain, and R stands for release. And if you're not super familiar with this, how this works, I suggest just doing a quick Google search on how ADSR works. But in a nutshell, what we're doing is we're just playing with the different timings of any specific sound that we're generating. So for instance, if we say we want our attack to be really high, then it's going to take a while for that sound to kick in, right? So check this out. You see how it rises there? And one of the things that I really like about Serum is just the ability to see where the ADSR is actually being activated while you're playing notes. The decay is just how long it takes for it to come down. And then, you know, the sustain is obviously while we're holding down our keyboard, how long the note is being played. If we have a sustain down, it's just going to go straight into the decay and just ignore the sustain. And then finally, the release is what we use if we want to sort of elongate the sound after the decay has hit, right? And that means once you've released your hand off of your keyboard or your MIDI controller. If you have a really long release, obviously, it's just going to keep going after you play a note. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about what our modulation envelope can be for. And this typically is seen in other synths as well, but some synths don't have this, right? So if you're working with a really old synthesizer like a, you know, kind of like a Juno 106 or a Prophet 5, they're not going to have, they will have what's called a filter envelope, but they're not going to have it in the same sense where you can modulate it, right? Because, you know, with modern synthesis and VSTs and plugins, you're able to do a ton of different things with modulation, where you can essentially, if you want to send this envelope to any one of these parameters here, you'll be able to do that. Same thing if you're using the matrix. You know, if you want to route the envelope to, let's say, envelope 2, and then send that to the cutoff filter, which is this one right here, then we're going to be able to modulate that. So let's say, for instance, I want the cutoff filter to have kind of like a punchier sound. I'll be able to do that with this specific filter right here. As you can hear there, the sound is being generated. And, you know, typically what I like to do is I like to have the attack fairly low. If I want to get like that plucky sound. And then just turn the sustain down on envelope 2. And if you want sort of like that brassier sound, you know, you can really come into the envelope here, start playing around with like this little curvature. You're kind of able to get like that brassy melodic techno kind of sound. And that's about it for the envelopes. Now, the next thing we want to look at is obviously LFOs and what these do. So LFOs stands for low frequency oscillator. And these are used in a lot of different situations to modulate different parameters on your synthesizer using an LFO. An LFO can either be triggered, it can be in an envelope setting, or it can just be off where it's just running freely. So let's go ahead and see what it sounds like when I were to drag this LFO to the wavetable position. Well, now what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the LFO to do this. We're trying to get it to modulate between different waveforms, right? So if I have this LFO set, and we're actually going to use a BPM, so we're going to do it based on my project's tempo, which is 120, and we're going to have that LFO sweep through these basic shapes at a quarter note. So let's see what that sounds like. You know, if we were to increase the rhythm pattern, it'll go faster. If we reduce it, let's actually turn the sustain all the way up so we can hear the effect. So as you can see there, what the LFO is doing is it's just rotating through the different wave shapes that we have selected. And, you know, if we were to use a different wavetable, for instance, like the Matrix 64, the LFO would still do the same thing and it would sound different. Now, while not every VST or synthesizer is going to be a wavetable synthesizer, and you may not be able to actually scroll through all the different wavetables, you can use the LFO for a lot of different things. So for instance, let's say I want to have a second oscillator, and I'm actually going to remove this one, but let's say I have a second oscillator, and I want it just to detune a little bit on the second oscillator. What I would do here is I would drag the LFO1 into the fine tuning of oscillator B, and then you can kind of create that nice sort of, you know, warbly effect that you get with a lot of vintage synthesizers. Where it sounds like the analogness is kind of drifting a little bit, and that's something that happens with a lot of different synthesizers, and especially with the old ones, you know, you kind of get that old circuitry sound where it sounds like it's kind of slowly warping back and forth. You know, LFOs are really useful for a lot of different things, but hopefully with those two applications, you can kind of see the different possibilities that you have, you know, with LFOs. You know, you can even drag it to, let's say, the cutoff filter and sort of create like this nice little wavy effect. Actually, I have to take off the first envelope 2 and then just route the LFO to it. You know, one of the cool things about Serum as well is, you know, it has this rise and delay parameters on the LFO. So if you want the LFO to kick in a little bit later, it'll do that as well. If you turn on the smooth, it'll just kind of make it smoother. And that's essentially how LFOs work, you know. And with Serum, you have a bunch of different types of curvatures and different things that you can do with the LFO to kind of give your sound some energy or some different sort of patterns going on. So it's always important to play with it. The next thing I wanted to talk about was just the voicing on Serum, and this is something that's really useful. You know, if you're working with sounds that don't require multiple notes to be played, it's always important to put that in mono, just because it'll save you some CPU. Obviously, if you're working with 7 voices here and 7 voices here, and then with polyphony of, you know, however many Serum can go up to, which it looks like it can go up to 1024 voices, your CPU meter is going to be having a hard time. So, you know, as an example, if I were to play 16 voices from oscillator B and oscillator A, you know, my CPU is most likely going to, yeah, see, it's already at 15% right there, and I'm only playing 4 notes. But obviously those 4 notes are being multiplied by 16 voices on oscillator B, 16 on A, and with polyphony of 32, you know, as you start kind of going through different notes, your CPU meter is just going to keep rising. So it's always important to make sure that you're checking this and not just, you know, assigning a bunch of voices together just because, right? You know, it's definitely important to preserve CPU as you're building tracks. And if you really do want to use that many, you know, then just create your pattern, freeze it, and then call it a day so that you don't have to worry about, you know, saving CPU resources, right? So you can always just go into here, and you can just drag and drop that pattern that you just did, and then you know, you can go back to your synthesizer. So with all that said, you know, there's a couple other little minor things that's always nice to know about with any synthesizer is sort of like the legato. And what this does in a nutshell is basically kind of give your sounds a little bit of this kind of flavor. It just takes the amount of different time that, you know, from one sound to the next, how much of a different waviness there is. This is also a really good tool if you're trying to create rising effects. The last thing I also want to look at is just sort of the bend wheel and what this does. You know, if you have a mod wheel or a bend wheel, this is telling you how many notes you're going to be bending through from each one to the next. Obviously, the higher the value, the more it's going to bend up and down. And you know, the mod wheel is also super useful if you're trying to modulate something specifically when you're using your MIDI controller. So in this case, you can go into Serum and click on mod wheel. And if you wanted to assign that to the filter cutoff, you can do so right there. And actually, the last thing I keep saying the last thing, but the last thing that I think is really cool about a synthesizer like Serum is the ability to play with the global page. And I love being able to come in here and play with all these different settings. You know, the width basically for oscillator A and oscillator B allows you to change how stereo it is. A lot of times when we're sound designing, everything just is sounding great because it's always stereo, but you know, more often than not, whenever you're doing large mixes with a lot of different instruments, you don't want everything to share the same stereo field. So being able to come down here and bringing this, you know, to about 50 or 0 on oscillator A, and then oscillator B can be wider, is super helpful. You know, you can also stack sound. So in this case, if I wanted to stack a sound by an octave and then add a seventh into it, Serum will do that. So you can hear it here. So if you're ever running out of oscillators and you don't have you know, enough voicing, you can always come to here and stack more sounds on top of it. And this is just a really super helpful tool that I love using whenever I'm working with Serum. And then last but not least, I just want to kind of give you guys a quick overview on the velocity note, because this is super cool if you're trying to create some really unique effects. So let's say, for instance, I have a arpeggiated pattern. So I'm just going to draw a really simple arpeggiated pattern real quick. That's just going to go like this. And this will just be an example for what we're going to be doing. But as you can tell here, there's different velocity settings. So I'm going to set the first one pretty low, second one to about 50, then this one to 77, and then this one really high. And what you're going to notice is with those velocity settings, if we were to assign the velocity to, let's say, a reverb, then those velocity notes are going to be hitting harder and harder as it goes up. So check this out. So you can see right there that with each one of these different velocity notes, the reverb is going to be hitting harder and harder, or in other words, it's going to continue going to the right depending on how high that velocity note is. So let's actually try a reverb that has a little bit more of a presence so that we can hear what's going on. So let's go back here. And obviously that example is a little quiet, but you can sort of get the idea of what's happening, right? Each one of these notes is triggering a different set in the reverb parameter. So and that's one of the cool tricks that you can do with the velocity source parameter, which is super cool. Well guys, this was a video talking about the basics of synthesis. I hope this was super helpful. There's obviously a lot that Serum can do that hasn't been covered, but I just wanted to make a video that just kind of went over the the fundamentals of synthesis, and I hope that this video helped you learn something new today. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.